Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most basic, fundamental questions you can ask in science. Where does life actually come from? For thousands of years, the answer seemed, well, kind of obvious. But as we're about to see, the real answer was hiding in a world that nobody had ever even seen. For literally millennia, people just assumed that life could just, poof, appear out of nowhere, out of non-living stuff. And it wasn't just some wild guess. It seemed like they saw it happen all the time. But it took a series of really brilliant, really careful experiments to finally show that what we see isn't always the whole story. All right, so to really get to the bottom of this debate, we've got to shrink down. Way, way down. We need to explore an invisible world that's all around us, a world that is absolutely teeming with life. And that brings us to the science of microbiology. So what is microbiology? Well, it's basically the study of all the living things that are too tiny to see with your own eyes. We're talking bacteria, fungi, viruses, a whole hidden ecosystem. These little guys are everywhere, and they are the key to unlocking this entire mystery. And look, this isn't just some dusty old science, right? This stuff matters. A lot. The microscopic world impacts pretty much everything in our lives, from the food we make and the crops we grow to the vaccines and antibiotics that keep us healthy. Understanding this stuff is absolutely vital. Our story today, it takes place right in the middle of all this, in what we call the transition era. This was a real turning point, a time when this ancient, long-held belief was about to go head-to-head with a brand new idea that was based on evidence. So let's start with the idea that was the law of the land for, well, forever. It was a concept that even the great philosopher Aristotle believed in, and it all started with just looking around at the world. This was the heart of the theory of spontaneous generation. The main idea was pretty simple. Life doesn't always need a parent. Nope, it can just spring into being from totally non-living stuff, as long as the conditions were right. And you kind of can't blame them. It seemed to make perfect sense based on what they saw every day. You leave some grain in a corner, and sooner or later, you've got rats. You leave a piece of meat out, and bam, maggots appear. To them, it was proof. So what was the magic ingredient? Well, they believed in this invisible life force they called pneuma, or vital heat. They thought this essence was just floating around in the air and in matter, just waiting to kickstart life. But then, in the 17th century, this old idea runs into its first real challenger. An Italian scientist named Francesco Redi thought, maybe common sense isn't enough. He decided to actually test the idea with a wonderfully simple experiment. He decided to tackle one of the classic examples head-on, the maggots on the meat. He asked a really simple, direct question. Do maggots just appear out of rotting meat, or is something else going on here? And his setup was just brilliant. So simple, but so smart. This was one of the first times anyone ever used what we now call a control group, that open jar, just to see what normally happens. The other two jars were designed to test one thing and one thing only. Could flies get to the meat? And when he looked at the results, whoa, it was crystal clear. The only jar that had maggots on the meat was the one that was wide open. The sealed jar, nothing. And the real kicker, the gauze-covered jar had no maggots on the meat, but you could see flies on top of the gauze. The takeaway here was huge. Redi proved, without a doubt, that maggots come from flies. They come from the tiny eggs the flies lay. In other words, life comes from other life. This brand new idea was called biogenesis, and it was the first real shot fired in this great debate. But you'd think that would be the end of it, right? Nope. The debate wasn't over. It just got smaller. It moved from the world of flies and meat to the invisible world of microbes floating in broth. Fast forward about 100 years, and a guy named John Needham comes along. He does a new experiment with broth. He boils it to kill everything he thought, and then covers it. A few days later, it's cloudy and full of tiny swimming things. He said, "See? I killed everything. This new life must have come from the broth." This is where science gets really cool. Another scientist, Lazzaro Spallanzani, looks at Needham's experiment and thinks, I see a problem here. He figured maybe microbes from the air were getting in after the boiling. So he changed the method. He put the broth in the flask, sealed it up completely airtight, and then he boiled it. And the result? Nothing. The broth stayed perfectly clear.
Spallanzani basically proved that the air itself was carrying these tiny, invisible germs. If you could keep the air out, you could keep the broth sterile. But even then, the other side wasn't ready to give up. They had one last argument. They claimed that Spallanzani hadn't disproven them at all. They argued that by sealing the flask and boiling it so much, he had destroyed the pneuma, that magical vital force in the air that was needed for life to begin. Now, the debate would eventually be put to rest for good by the one and only Louis Pasteur. But what Redi and Spallanzani did was arguably just as important, because it wasn't just about getting the right answer, it was about creating a whole new way of finding the right answer.
And that's why we remember Francesco Redi as the father of experimental biology. It wasn't just what he found, it was how he found it. He showed the world a powerful new way to ask questions about nature.
And that's the process we now call the scientific method. It's this simple but powerful formula. Ask a question, make a testable guess, a hypothesis, design an experiment with controls to test it, and then analyze what happened. It's the foundation of all modern science. So, in the end, biogenesis won the day. The idea was summed up perfectly later on by Rudolf Virchow with this Latin phrase, omnis cellula e cellula. It means all cells from cells. Life comes from life. It's as simple and as profound as that.
I mean, think about it. This methodical way of thinking completely overturned an idea that was common sense for thousands of years. And in the process, it revealed an entire invisible universe. So it really makes you wonder, right? What obvious truths that we believe today are just waiting for the right person to ask the right question?